All right, here we go. Mesopotamia notes, part two. So, as everything is going on, like you learned in part one, a little bit of change starts to happen. Around the year 2400 BCE, so we're talking about over 4,400 years ago, Sumer, that's that southern part of Mesopotamia down over here. So, Sumer got some competition from the areas north of Sumer. So, the northern part of Mesopotamia was known as Akkad, and it was ruled by a guy, Sargon the First. So here is the area Akkad, and the king of Akkad is Sargon the First. Oh, and I actually thought I was going to get to this in the notes part one, and I didn't. So I'm going to tell you now so I don't forget. This green here is all fertile land in Mesopotamia and the neighboring lands. And Mesopotamia sometimes is called the Fertile Crescent because the fertile land makes like a crescent shape. All right. So Sargon the First, king of Akkad, right over here. And Sargon living his life. It's good to be king. And he's ruling Akkad, but he wants what Sumer has, all the riches and great soil. So he leads his army south to Sumer and conquers the area one by one. So in comes Sargon the First with his army, and slowly but surely, Lagash, Uruk, all under Sargon the First's control. Because remember, they're not united. It's every city-state for itself. So by controlling Mesopotamia, he essentially has created the world's first empire. He's the first one to kind of do this. An empire is when you have multiple groups of land under one ruler. Now, because Sargon the First controlled the whole region, he makes the language that his people speak, Akkadian, the official spoken language of this new Mesopotamian empire. So everybody has to learn Akkadian. Sumerians can still speak their native language only when they're worshiping the gods and goddesses, because this is an important theme you're going to learn in ancient history. You don't want to anger the gods. You don't want to do anything that could make the gods angry, because the Mesopotamians thought the gods could force their crops not to grow, and then they don't have food and all that kind of stuff. Now, sometimes this might be you right now. You might be thinking like, well, what does their language sound like? We have no idea. We know what their writing system translates into English after years and years and years and years and years of historians and archaeologists studying, but we have no idea what it sounded like because there's no voice recorders in there. If only the Mesopotamians made TikToks like people today, then we'd know what their voice sounds like. But they didn't, so we don't know. All right. So Sumerian religion starts to become popular all through the new empire, and soon all of Mesopotamia starts worshiping the Sumerian gods and goddesses. Cuneiform was still allowed as a written language in the new empire, and it starts to get spread all over because it was a great idea. Sargon controls Mesopotamia for over 50 years. Then he dies. And you're going to see this pattern throughout the entire year of ancient people that we study. When there's a ruler that's very powerful, if the next one to come in isn't equal to or better, people will revolt. And that's what happens. Sargon II, Sargon the First son, takes over. He's not as good. People are like, why are we listening to him? At least Sargon did stuff. This guy stinks. And they revolt for their freedom back. And then Mesopotamia goes back to being every city-state for itself. So you're going to see this theme a lot, where there's a ruler that takes over a big area, rules it for a long time, and then when they die, their son isn't as good, people revolt, down goes the empire. So that's what happens to Sargon's empire. Goes back to every city-state for itself. All right, for the next 600 years, let's just grasp that. So we're now fast forwarding 600 years in Mesopotamia. City-states are independent, they're doing their thing, life is good, there's not war in this 600 years, they're just kind of living the Mesopotamian dream, essentially. I'll bring this up. Live in the Mesopotamian dream unless you were a woman or a slave, because obviously there's nothing great about your life in Mesopotamia, unfortunately. All right. So it leads to this next guy that's going to take over in power, Hammurabi from the city-state of Babylon. All right. So around the year 1800 BCE, so we're talking about 3,800 years ago, a group of people called the Amorites settled in an open area in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, which is right over here, and you can see the city that they form, Babylon. So they build this brand new city, Babylon, and the king of Babylon is Hammurabi. And Hammurabi, when he takes over, he says, I want to do for Babylon what Sargon did for Akkad, and that's be in charge of everyone in Mesopotamia, conquer everybody. So Hammurabi sends his army north to take Akkad and south to take Sumer. So here's Hammurabi. He's like, boom, down goes Akkad. Boom, down goes Sumer. Now Hammurabi is like, yeah, I'm in charge now. And once Babylon controlled Mesopotamia, every city's way of doing things, their culture, which means their way of life, starts to mix. For example, everyone in Mesopotamia start learning the Babylonians' language, the language of Babylon. Everyone in Babylon starts worshiping the Sumerian gods and goddesses. And Hammurabi wanted to kind of play this up a little bit. So in Babylon, there was this god of Babylon, Marduk. And Hammurabi wanted to make sure that everyone worshipped Marduk. Normally, you would only worship a city god or goddess in that city. But Hammurabi says, well, I'm from Babylon, and Babylon's in charge of all of you, so you can add Marduk to your prayer list of which gods or goddesses you should pray to, because Babylon's in charge of everything, and Marduk's the god of Babylon. So Hammurabi isn't just happy with just Mesopotamia. He wants even more land, so he goes west all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So I'm going to show you on this map here. So here's Mesopotamia. This is where Sumer was. There's Akkad. There's Babylon. So Hammurabi takes all this and then says, yoink, I want all this land over here going all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And he does it. He conquers it. All right. Now, Hammurabi does make some improvements for the Mesopotamians. Irrigation systems, that whole levees, canals, channel system, it's in good shape. Taxes were fair. They weren't being overcharged for things. And the government helped people find homes. So there's some good. Now, in history, when you have a change that leads to something good, that's called a reform. And the reform that Hammurabi is most famous for is developing a code, which is a system of laws. Hammurabi takes the laws of all the local cities he conquers, puts them together to create laws for his whole empire to follow. Because when you're going to be in charge of this many people, you need rules. So Hammurabi wants to make sure his code was followed fairly and justly. So to do that, if somebody broke a law, a judge would hear their case and see if the law was broken. That should sound very familiar to you. Some things that we do date back all the way to the Mesopotamian times. Hammurabi's code covered almost everything in daily life. And the philosophy of this code is that somebody should be innocent until there's proof that they're guilty. Now, that is another thing we take from the Mesopotamians. However, as people living in 2020 in the United States, I think we all can agree that sometimes we don't do that. We're supposed to assume everyone's innocent until proven guilty. However, I'm going to give you a prime example of how that doesn't happen. Let's say right now, as you're watching this, if you're watching this in school, if you're not watching this in school, then you kind of have to play along with this kind of situation. Let's say the office buzzes in and I have to send a student down to the office. There are so many of you that the first thought in your head is, what'd they do wrong? They got busted for something. They're caught. When really, it could be, oh, you forgot something. Here it is. So we sometimes don't assume someone's innocent until there's proof that they're guilty. Sometimes we do the opposite. So, punishments in Hammurabi's code range from fines to death, depending on the crime. In Mesopotamia, there was no prison. Now, the laws are written also where it has the consequence in the law. Like, if you do this, here is the punishment. Now, if you were wealthy, if you were a member of the upper class, your punishment was more severe than if you were in the middle or lower class, because Hammurabi says, well, you're rich, you can read and write, therefore you should know better. Next. As I mentioned, the code is written so that it said, if you do this, this is the consequence. And it follows what's called an eye for an eye philosophy. Because a lot of times the consequences get a similar result. For example, in one of the laws, it says, if somebody breaks another person's bone, they get their bone broken. Now, let me explain this. If you break somebody's bone, like break somebody's arm on purpose, and there's a trial and the judge says you're guilty, then as punishment, your arm gets broken. It's not a matter of like, you broke my arm and then you just do it. No, a judge has to order that kind of thing. So it's called eye for an eye because a lot of times the consequence is similar to what happened. All right. Now, there's a total of 282 laws in the code, and it was found by French archaeologists in the year 1901. It's on display in an art museum in Paris, France. Because of that, it's called the Louvre. And if you go to the Louvre, this is what you see. So here's Hammurabi. Hammurabi is actually over here on the left, and this is the sun god Shamash. So Hammurabi's like, I got these laws from the sun god Shamash. So there you go. Oh, and let me show you this. This is a close-up of the cuneiform on Hammurabi's code, so you get a good sense of those symbols that you could see there. All right. Next. During Hammurabi's rule, Babylon becomes a great place to trade different things. People would trade their surplus, their extra stuff, for the goods that they needed. And Hammurabi rules for over 40 years. And when he's in charge, this period in history is called the Golden Age of Babylon because of how great his city Babylon thrived during this Mesopotamian time period. But here we have a familiar story. When Hammurabi dies, his son, Hammurabi II, stinks as a leader, not going to live up to his dad as a leader. The city-states then say, this stinks, this guy stinks, we're better off on our own again, and they revolt and get their own freedom, and down goes the empire, and now it's back to every city-state for itself. All right. Now, to give you some more examples of Hammurabi's code, because they're pretty crazy, I'll give you some more examples. If you stole something and are found guilty, they chopped your hand off so that everyone would know you can never be trusted. So people didn't steal because obviously, like, nobody wants that. If you killed someone, obviously, then you're sentenced to death if you're found guilty. Now this is interesting. This next thing, you might be. Here, let me get off this, and then you can look at City Field. Of course, that's my background. But let me kind of tell this story as you have a clear backdrop. So let's say the judge couldn't decide who was innocent and who was guilty. Here's what they would do. They would take one of the people, put them in a boat, sail to the middle of the Tigris or the Euphrates River, whichever was closer, and throw them out of the boat. If the person could swim back to the shore, they believed that person is innocent, and the person that accused them of a crime is sentenced to death, and the innocent person gets all that other person's stuff and belongings. Now, you might be thinking, oh, that's nothing. First of all, it's a river. Rivers are very, 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 very huge. Number two, there's crocodiles in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So, you can swim all you want, but, you got to deal with the crocs too. Now, let's say the person died in the river. Then what the judge would say is the gods are declaring this person guilty. That's why they killed them. So as a reward, the person that accused the other one of a crime, you get all this person's stuff. So they had this weird system of breaking ties with this. All right, so that wraps up Mesopotamian Notes Part 2. It's awkward stopping again.